Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice was written in 1813, but in many ways, the novel is more popular today than it was during the early 19th century. The book sells hundreds of thousands of copies every year, some, obviously, to people who are reading it for school, but many to people who are reading it just for their own pleasure. There have been multiple movie and TV adaptations of the story, and in fact, over 300 novels have been written in the last 20 or 25 years that either adapt the story or extend the story of Pride and Prejudice in some way. So it's a very popular book, and it's become sort of a cultural force in our society. So even if you haven't ever read the story or haven't seen any of the film adaptations of it, you're probably at least familiar with the book in some way. And maybe either the characters, Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet, or at very least the title, Pride and Prejudice, is certainly a phrase that you've heard many times. But it's important to remember that this novel is set in and is about a very different social world than the world that we inhabit. Regency-era England, in other words, the time period in which Jane Austen lived and wrote, was a highly stratified society. Social class has always been more important in England than it is in America, but at the time of Pride and Prejudice, that difference was even more marked. So there are a couple of things that we need to remember when reading this novel. First of all social interactions in the book are affected, and in some ways governed, by social class. Your prospects in life were certainly affected by your social class in the Regency era, but so were many aspects of everyday life. In some cases, who you could interact with or even talk to was governed by social class. So there's a scene in Volume 1 of Pride and Prejudice in which Elizabeth Bennet, main character of the novel, is mortified when her cousin, Mr. Collins, walks up to Mr. Darcy, who is wealthier than Mr. Collins, and begins a conversation. Now, there are plenty of objectionable things about Mr. Collins, and I think we'll agree that there are lots of things we maybe don't like about him. But here, what Elizabeth is reacting to is the social norm or rule that Mr. Collins is breaking. Because Mr. Darcy is of a higher social class than Mr. Collins, technically it should be Mr. Darcy who initiates the interaction between them. That probably seems a little nuts to you, but it was an important element of Austen's world, this kind of codification of social class through rules of social interaction. And of course, the main social interaction governed by class in the novel is that of marriage. The entire plot of the novel revolves around issues of marriage and the restrictions on marriage resulting from class differences. Generally speaking, men and women in the Regency era were expected to marry within their own social class. Marrying below your position in society would affect your social standing, and it's that consideration that motivates and complicates much of the novel. But the second thing that's really important to remember in this book is that class is not the same as wealth or money, but it's not entirely separate from it either. In America, we equate social class with wealth. When we say that someone is of the upper class, it means they have more money than people of the lower classes. But in England, especially before 1900, class was a product of your family lineage, not your wealth. In other words, who your parents were. The only way to become a member of the aristocracy, for example, was to be born to aristocratic parents. And conversely, if you were born a commoner, you would remain a commoner your entire life. Now, obviously, most of the people in the aristocracy were, in fact, more wealthy than people in the lower classes, since the aristocracy owned most of the land in England. But it was possible, especially the closer we get to the 20th century, for a commoner to gain wealth and eventually have as much money as members of the aristocracy. But that still didn't make those commoners aristocrats. In Pride and Prejudice, money is actually a more present concern than class is, though class is still very important in the novel. To understand why, we need to look a little more closely at the way social classes were understood at the time. Look at this diagram found in a book written in 1814, or just about the time that Pride and Prejudice was written. It shows 7 social classes in England, starting with royalty and moving all the way down to paupers, gypsies, and criminals. A couple of things are apparent after looking at this diagram. First of all, we only get to see a small portion of English society in Pride and Prejudice. Virtually all of the characters that we meet in the novel belong to the second or third classes on this chart. Only Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who we'll meet in Volume 2, belongs to the first class, and she's really on the kind of lower peripheries of the first class. And only a very few characters, Elizabeth's aunt and uncle most notably, belong to the fourth. But look at the numbers that each class represented in 1814. If you took all the people of the first 4 classes on this chart combined, that's only about 1.5 million people. Sounds like a lot, but when you compare that number to the members of just that lowest 7th class, you'll see that the overwhelming majority of people in England in 1814 were considered poor. And those people, unfortunately, never show up in the novel at all. The lowest class character we meet in the novel is Hild, the Bennet's cook, and even she's only ever referred to in the novel. She doesn't get any lines or create any action in the story. So, this is a book about rich people and very rich people. The irony, then, is that so much emphasis in this novel is put on the financial differences between the characters. The Bennets, for example, the family that Elizabeth Bennet belongs to, is considered to be of somewhat lower status than characters like Mr. Darcy or Mr. Bingley because they have lower incomes than those wealthy gentlemen, even though they're basically of the same general social class, what's usually called the landed gentry. That's just a term that means that the income of these characters, whether we're talking about Mr. Darcy, Mr. Bingley, or Mr. Bennet, Elizabeth's father, their income is a product not of work, they don't work for a living, but of land. In other words, they own land, and the money that they get each year is based on the rental income that they get from people living on that land. Like Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley, the Bennets own an estate, and their income comes directly from that estate. Their estate's called Longbourn. But the difference is that their estate, Longbourn, is much smaller than Mr. Darcy's estate, Pemberley, or Mr. Bingley's, which for a while anyway is Netherfield. The Bennets have an annual income, according to the novel, of about £2,000, while Mr. Bingley has an income of £5,000 and Mr. Darcy has an income of £10,000 a year. Now, those amounts are difficult to translate to our own money for a lot of reasons, not just the exchange rate, but just because there were so many different things that you did or did not have to spend money on at the time. But some scholars have tried to figure out how much the amounts of money in Pride and Prejudice would equal to in our own society. And a general consensus is that we could use a multiplier of 80 to get from the money in Pride and Prejudice to our own money. In other words, if the Bennets have about £2,000 a year, that means they have an income of about $160,000 a year. Now, that's a pretty good income. It may not make them super wealthy in our own society, but you might remember also that because they live on a hereditary estate, they don't have to pay a house payment or pay rent. Plus, the estate would produce its own food, so they don't have to pay for that either. So, from our perspective, the Bennets are actually doing pretty good. But Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy are much wealthier than the Bennets. If we use the multiplier of 80 again, Mr. Bingley earns around $400,000 a year, and Mr. Darcy earns somewhere around $800,000 a year, close to $1 million a year. Because Jane Austen uses, when she talks about income, she uses an interest rate of about 4 to 5%. That means that Mr. Darcy probably has about $25 million or so in personal wealth. So he's a very rich man. But money is actually more complicated than just the difference between £1,000, £2,000, £5,000, £10,000 a year in the novel and in the time period that the novel takes place in. And the reason has to do with the complex rules regarding inheritance during the Regency era. Generally speaking, during this time, estates were passed down in their entirety to the eldest son of the family. Now, that's great if you're an eldest son. If you're a younger son, you're usually kind of out of luck. Second sons, there's a character, Colonel Fitzwilliam in the novel, who is a younger son, and he talks about the fact that he has to marry a wealthy woman, or else he won't be able to survive. the social class of these younger sons wouldn't change. They would remain in the class in which they were born, but they wouldn't have the income to support themselves or to make themselves into a desirable husband for a young woman. Women of this class would want to marry men who had some wealth, and the men of the class would often want to marry women who had some wealth, especially if they were the younger sons. Sometimes second sons would go into the military, as Colonel Fitzwilliam did, or to the clergy, as since those professions came with guaranteed income and were considered appropriate for members of the upper classes. Sometimes second sons could find a wealthy young woman to marry, and that would solve their problem. But the problem is that there weren't that many wealthy young women, precisely because estates tended to be handed down to sons. So most daughters, if they had a brother, daughters wouldn't inherit much. Their fathers would set aside a certain amount of money for their annual maintenance, basically, but they wouldn't inherit the estate in most cases. Now, a girl who didn't have any brothers might be able to inherit her father's estate. There's a character named Miss King who seems to be in this situation in the novel. But in some special cases, even that path was closed to young women. After all, the Bennet girls don't have any brothers, and we learn very quickly that they are in a situation where they are not able to inherit their father's estate. And that's because sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes in this period, estates were what's called entailed away from the female line. And an entailment is just some kind of legal restriction on the way an estate is passed down. So in this case, there's some document, someone's will, or a legal document at some point in the Bennet family history that says Longbourn can only be passed down through the male line. This becomes a pretty important driver of the plot of the story because it's very important that Mr. Bennet be able to provide for his daughter since he is legally prohibited from passing his estate down to them directly. And in fact, we learned that on his death, the estate is going to go to his cousin, Mr. Collins. So the Bennet girls are in a difficult position. They're the daughters of a country gentleman. They're in the landed gentry, so they're considered to be in the upper classes. But their family income is, well, precarious, to say the least. It's not that large of an income to begin with, especially compared to some of the other characters in the book. And because of the entail, if the girls don't get married to wealthy gentlemen before their father dies, they may actually be forced to leave their home and survive without any income stream whatsoever. And that's why Mrs. Bennet, Elizabeth's mother, is so excited to find out in the novel's opening pages that a single, young, wealthy gentleman, Mr. Bingley, is moving into their neighborhood. She knows that Mr. Bingley, since he's single, will be looking for a wife, and a marriage between Mr. Bingley and one of her daughters will go a long way towards solving their looming financial problem. So I guess my point is, if Hollywood has tricked you into believing that Pride and Prejudice is some kind of early romance novel, you'll probably be a little surprised when you actually read it. While characters do fall in love in the book, there's very little of what we might consider romance. There are no true love scenes, not even so much as a kiss in the book. What there is in the novel is a lot of discussion of those two very important drivers of Regency-era high society, class and money.